The sledgehammer was on the ground. Next to it, a man groaned while automat Kalashnikov rifles were pointed at him. Nearby, there was a sapper shovel that would later be used against his neck. The hands that raised the sledgehammer again belonged to a mercenary who would turn that tool into something famous. A symbol of war and of the most well-known private military company in the world. His story would be marked by brutality. He went through Chechnya in the service of the Russian government. In 2014, he was already at war in Ukraine, long before the large-scale invasion in 2022. He witnessed terrorists shooting down Russian helicopters in the desert, but he was also an agent of terror. As a sniper, he took lives in Syria, often of people with hearts darker than his own. Later, he took part in one of the most famous battles in Syria when Russians faced Americans. Much of this was as a member of a mercenary group that used brutality as propaganda for their activities and the work they offered. Their business was death, and business was good. A sledgehammer became the symbol of the world's most famous mercenary group, one that a decade ago was seen as a shadowy organization whose existence many doubted. The video that would make the sledgehammer famous circulated in 2019, showing such brutal violence that it made clear how the mercenaries of the Wagner group solved their problems. It was no wonder that their motto was, "Our business is death and business is good." With each new campaign, they became more well-known. And one of the men who became the symbol of the sledgehammer and cruelty on the battlefield would end up marking another decisive chapter in the history of the Wagner group. Vladislav Apostol was born in Moldova on January 13, 1988. His father left the family very early. His mother went to work in Russia, leaving him and his brother Anatol in the care of their grandmother, the only figure who protected them from the world. The old woman supported them with what little she had and with the money their mother sent. When she died, Apostol was only 6 years old. The mother came back to get him and his brother, and the three of them traveled together to Russia. At that moment, there seemed to be a fragile hope of redemption amid such dark days. Until she took them to their new home. Neither of the two brothers smiled that day. They were placed in a boarding school where they were confined. Their mother visited them once a year, and on those rare occasions they would sit in silence, avoiding even making eye contact. While the hurt overflowed in restrained gestures, Apostol left that hell at 18 years old, his heart dried up of affection and overflowing with enough anger to bend the world to his fists. There was nothing better to channel so much hatred than the army. The year was 2008, and the remnants of the Chechen War were still smoldering. Operations against insurgents continued to erupt throughout the Caucasus. Grozny, the capital, had already been reduced to rubble a decade earlier, but the Kremlin still demanded the total crushing of the resistance. For Apostol, it was the perfect moment. That was where his true liberation began. As a sniper, he took down the Chechens with professional meticulousness. The Moldovan honored his dual citizenship, serving the Russians with cruel devotion. In a short time, he rose to squad leader. When the war cooled down, Apostol tried to start over. After completing his military service, he traded his rifle for a suit working in private security. But civilian life didn't suit him. Later, he became a skilled industrial sculpture worker at a factory in the Belgorod region. It was not a prosperous time. In 2012, he was already signing a contract with the troops of the Ministry of the Interior. Those were times of mystery. To his friends, he said he got a job in Chechnya without specifying what it was. On social media, photos of him later appeared, armed and wearing an unmarked uniform. 2 years later, he would be in Crimea. It was the year when the conflict in Ukraine began, when troops without insignia took over Ukrainian territory. Vladislav was at the beginning of what would become one of the most terrible wars of the 21st century. In a short time, he was already fighting in the Donbass alongside the separatist forces. And there he met the orchestra with whom he would play the symphony of war in the coming years. After the annexation of Crimea, a contingent of about 300 Russian mercenaries, including Apostol, infiltrated the Donbass as the hidden backbone of the separatist insurgency. Their actions were decisive in consolidating rebel control in the region, while Moscow maintained its strategy of plausible deniability. Resources flowed directly from the Kremlin to the force commanded by Prigozhin and Dmitry Utkin. The latter, a former lieutenant colonel of the main intelligence directorate of the Russian General Staff, joined forces with Putin's chef to create a uniquely lucrative venture in the market of death. The organization would adopt Utkin's codename Wagner. While Richard Wagner, the composer, played symphonies adored by the Nazi regime, the Wagner group cultivated its own orchestra, where the instruments were rifles and the scores were ballistic trajectories in the skies over Donbass. Apostol was probably among the first recruits in that group of mercenaries. Operating in the shadows, they became architects of chaos, sabotaging checkpoints, paralyzing government institutions, and looting Ukrainian arsenals. Experts in reconnaissance, ambushes, and military intelligence, these ghost soldiers secured strategic cities while maintaining total plausible deniability. It was unconventional warfare in its purest form. Men without identity conquering territory for a flag they did not officially represent. Among them, future brothers in arms moved. Yakungi Mirazorov, codenamed Pamir, because of the mountain ranges that cast shadows over the city where he was born in Tajikistan, was already being recruited by Wagner. He served in the Russian forces for only 2 years, but after spending some time in prison for theft, he was already prepared to fight as a mercenary. When the battle for Debaltseve began in 2015, it seemed that everything was in the hands of the separatist forces of Donbass. The city was surrounded on 3 sides by pro-Russian forces. To the Kremlin's dismay, the soldiers of the Donetsk People's Republic and the Luhansk People's Republic failed miserably to retake the Ukrainians' position. The forces loyal to Kiev fired at troops made up of former soldiers and people with little military experience at the time. The Ukrainian PKMs mowed down these intrepid but disorganized soldiers. A Kiev BMP-2 fired rounds from its cannon at the separatists from Donetsk and Luhansk. Cornered, the insurgents persisted with tenacity, returning fire with everything they had. Thick clouds of battle smoke rose from the enemy positions, mixing with the acrid smell of gunpowder and earth churned up by the impacts. The Ukrainian artillery used what they had to put the Russians in a difficult position. The rain of metal that brought death among the pro-Kremlin soldiers was fired during the winter. The DPR units had to deal with this destruction. Their leadership failed to push the advance, seeing only wounded men asking for medical help. It seemed impossible that a city surrounded on 3 sides could still hold out. Russian intelligence got tired of this. That's when the Wagner group stepped in, along with other troops from the main directorate of the General Staff of the Armed Forces of the Russian Federation. Among these men were Apostol and other experienced and brutal soldiers. Oleg Kong, known as Kong, served between 1900 and 1995 in a Special Forces brigade. He fought in Chechnya and was wounded there. He had a brother who served in the Russian Security Service, one of the agencies that succeeded the KGB. With these credentials and still living near one of the Wagner Group's bases in Russia, it didn't take long for him to join the orchestra. The response was devastating against the Ukrainians. A storm of mortar fire shattered Debaltsev. Continuous explosions shook the city like a prolonged earthquake. Under the deluge of steel and fire, the Ukrainian lines began to give way. Thick curtains of battle smoke swallowed the entire city, turning the urban landscape into a surreal nightmare. With each new impact, the Ukrainian defenses disintegrated further. It was then that the separatist forces launched their final attack. Through the gray mist, the silhouettes of the advancing fighters emerged. Machine guns roaring, grenades exploding, the ground trembling under the weight of their relentless advance. Debaltsev was falling. Finally, in February 2015, the Ukrainian resistance was shattered. Their soldiers began a desperate retreat, with dozens of armored vehicles carrying the men through the frozen corners of winter. The smoke at that moment came from the vehicles' engines, but that would change. The Wagner group unleashed its artillery to fire on those troops who had given the Russians so much trouble. The shots flew across the fields and fell upon the Ukrainian columns. The destruction made the vehicles stop. Men were torn apart when struck by the fury of the mercenaries. The dead and wounded were abandoned during the retreat. Such was the desperation. The Ukrainians began to experience the brutality of the Wagner group, even though at that time the credit was given to the separatist forces. Apostol came out of that fight more experienced, earning his ticket to Syria. At that same time, another future partner of Apostol joined the orchestra's troops. Vladimir Kitaev, codenamed Chinese, a former soldier of Russia's 14th Special Forces Brigade and convicted for stabbing, signed the contract claiming he wanted to improve his financial situation and was already ready to go to Syria with Apostol. Vladislav Ponchuk, who served in the internal troops of the Ministry of Internal Affairs, just like his Moldovan colleague, claimed the same reason for signing with the Wagner group. A group of cold-blooded killers who would laugh together at torture was beginning to form. Apostol's contract took him to new places in 2016. He flew to Syria, a country where Russia had deployed part of its war machine. Much of the help in keeping al-Assad in power at that time came from air support, but the Wagner group was there to march toward the positions of any force that was against the government. Apostol started in the 4th Assault Detachment, together with Stanislav Ditko, codenamed Scarab. Grimir Azorov-Palmer was also already there with Apostol after they had fought in Donbass. At that time, the Moldovan was already well known by his codename Volk or Wolf, according to the tattoo he had on his neck. They served under the command of the Belarusian Nikolai Budkin, who was a platoon vice commander in the Belarusian Airborne Forces, before moving to Russia, receiving citizenship, and then signing with the orchestra. They marched to Palmyra shortly after, walking in that dry environment, knowing that Islamic State of Iraq and Syria was lurking. In 2015, the jihadists crushed Palmyra under their claws, desecrating its ancient temples. Syrian troops recaptured it in 2016, but the triumph was short-lived. In the winter of that year, the jihadists returned like a recurring nightmare, claiming the martyred city once again. The macabre dance of conquest and ruin was about to continue when the Wagner group entered the city after Russian airstrikes. Their tanks fired until they gave every Islamic State of Iraq and Syria soldier his wish to become a martyr. Those tanks struggled with the existence of the Islamic organization. The terror did not give in easily. The Syrian government army persisted with Russian support. It was Wagner on the ground and the Russian Air Force in the air sending more and more jihadists to hell. The Islamic State kept their weapons ready, watching as Russian helicopters were flying over Palmyra. They were confident, watching as the Islamic terrorists burned down below. They considered themselves safe in machines like the Mi-35. The twin-barreled 23mm cannon, mounted in a fixed turret under the nose of the helicopter, fired up to 450 rounds per minute. The unguided rockets turned the Islamic State positions into a hell of steel and fire. But the jihadists, hardened by years of war, waited with the patience of hunters. When the targeting system finally locked onto the spinning target in the sky, the Terror missile fired with vengeful lightning. The projectile hit the helicopter with a blinding flash. The aircraft now spun out of control while cries of Allahu Akbar echoed through the trenches below. The final impact came with a dull thud, tons of metal and fuel crashing against the desert ground. Even as the flames devoured the wreckage, a second helicopter descended, attempting an impossible rescue. Hope died when a secondary explosion engulfed everything, leaving only silence and a black column of smoke hovering over the carnage. The pressure on the jihadists reached its climax, turning their cries of faith into death rattles of despair. Cornered in the relentless desert, they watched in horror as the tank cannons spat fire against the twilight sky. Each shot was a death sentence that decimated their ranks. In one advance, they saw comrades torn apart by artillery, limbs ripped off, bodies reduced to mere sacks of bloody flesh. When the last explosion echoed, silencing their cries for good, only the agonizing moans of the dying remained. Soldiers who, one by one, surrendered their bodies to the hungry sand, while the darkness consumed them forever. Palmyra fell. Later, Apostol advanced with the Wagner group to Deir ez-Zor. Mikhail Masharov joined Apostol's squad in January of that year. He was much less experienced. Igor Krizanovsky, the Ricochet, signed the contract at the same time. After the fall of Palmyra, in March 2017, the Wagner Group and the Syrian government intended to head to Deir ez-Zor and break the siege that the Islamic State had imposed on the city for 3 years. In the middle of this process, Apostol and his squad had an encounter that would forever mark their history and that of the Wagner Group. The battle in Deir ez-Zor unfolded in the typical Syrian way, brutal, under scorching heat and with death showing no respect for uniforms or civilian clothes. Apostol had among his duties being one of the snipers of the Wagner Group, a job he had held since the days when he officially worked for the Russian troops. Now, from the shadows of a mercenary group, the lens of his scope targeted enemies in the Syrian desert, and he fired heavy ammunition at Islamic State soldiers. His shots took down many of the terrorists, which even made it seem like the mercenary was part of the forces of good, freeing the world from the horror of those jihadists. War may have good people, but there are also plenty of shadows where bad people fight each other. When the light tears through those shadows, it exposes crimes that the world judges with double standards. Hamad Buta would learn this when he met Vladislav Apostol and his squad. This Syrian had left the country in 2011 when the protests against Assad began. He took his wife and 4 children to Lebanon, where he worked for years, even hearing news that his homeland had been devastated by the civil war. At the beginning of 2017, the Russians bombed Crete, taking the life of his mother Aisha on the way to collaborate with the Syrian government against the rebel forces. Bulta returned to Syria alone after that, but was arrested by the government, which claimed he was wanted for mandatory military service. He sent a message to his family saying he would escape and then disappeared. He managed to escape but got lost in the desert. Thirsty and hungry, he ended up approaching a military camp near the Al-Shaya gas plant in Ronsk, northwest of Palmyra. He was received by the soldiers of the Wagner Group. Among them was Apostol, who received him together with Jerongir Mirzorov, Mikhail Masharov, Vladimir Kitaev, Vladislav Panchuk, Oleg Kong, Andrei Bakunovich, and Igor Krizanovsky. It was not by chance that they were there. The Wagner Group did not work for free. There was a lucrative agreement for their participation in the battles alongside the Assad regime to drive Islamic State of Iraq and Syria out of Syrian extraction fields, including the Al-Shaya plant. Evropolis, one of Prigozhin's companies, reportedly secured about $162 million in profits in 2017 in Syria through a revenue-sharing agreement from these plants. Apostol and the mercenaries captured Buta and at first didn't know what to do with him, but soon they accused him of being an Islamic State of Iraq and Syria spy. They turned to their superiors to find out what to do with the captured deserter. Sources differ. Some say that Utkin himself, Wagner, gave the order. Others say the words came from the Belarusian Nikolai Budik. Either way, Buta's hell began. The beating was already well underway at that point. Bulta was crawling on the ground, bleeding, when Apostol arrived with the sledgehammer. His armed comrades held the prisoner. One of them pinned the Syrian's arm against the sand with his foot. The plea for mercy or the face twisted in pain did not stop the movement that made a semicircle in the air until the sledgehammer struck his body. He repeated the action a few times, but Buta was stubborn and insubordinate. He pulled his hand away with each blow, and the sledgehammer struck the ground with a dull thud. That made the bears laugh as if they were watching one of those children's animal cartoons from the 80s. Moldavo got irritated, changed his attitude, but the Syrian also refused to have his feet smashed by the sledgehammer. The anger only grew inside Apostol. He approached Buta and kicked his chest, which was covered by blood-stained clothes. The Syrian groaned as his broken ribs creaked under Apostol's foot. Buta begged for mercy once again and got distracted by the pain. That gave the Moldovan time to bring down the sledgehammer. The hard metal crushed through bone and flesh, deforming the prisoner's hand and sending spikes of pain that made him writhe. He screamed on the ground for more than a minute, pushed by the feet of the Russians who were filming him. Vladislav sat in front of him and watched his suffering for a few moments. A new blow from the sledgehammer struck Bolta's feet, drawing more laughter from the Russians. They filmed the suffering, the pleas for help that would never be answered. In the end, Bauta died on the sands of his country, killed by foreigners who were supposed to help. When death is a business, brutality is the advertisement. They used an entrenching shovel to decapitate the Syrian's corpse in an operation that lasted more than a minute, filmed and celebrated with gestures that would make the Apostle famous. After they cut off the head and hands, they hung the body upside down. They took the opportunity for another photo, proud of their work. Two of the mercenaries poured gasoline through the opening in the pants. Apostol held a torch next to Stanislav Editiko. They filmed happily before the Moldovan finally lit the final flame in the cycle of brutality. The proud looks and jokes showed the pleasure in the deeds of that day. Months later, at the end of 2017, Apostol fought alongside his companions to achieve the liberation of Deir ez-Zor. During the fighting, Igor Krizanovsky, the ricochet who had arrived in January, went with them to attempt an attack on an oil refinery. He was hit by a sniper and died on the spot, having lasted 9 months in combat. Even so, Deir ez-Zor fell to the power of Wagner and the Syrian government. The mercenaries served as heroes full of confidence. That confidence would lead to a bold attack against the Americans nearby. Wagner couldn't stop. After Deir ez-Zor, his eyes lit up when he learned that the Kono power plant, one of the main ones in the region, was protected by only 30 American soldiers and a few soldiers from the Syrian Democratic Forces, or Syrian Democratic Forces, an organization made up of Kurds. There was a deconfliction line there to prevent Russian-backed government forces from engaging in direct combat with the United States-backed Syrian Democratic Forces. Even so, at 3 o'clock in the afternoon on February 7th, Apostol began to gather with his colleagues on the west bank of the Euphrates. The military group led by the Wagner group crossed the river. American officers, while monitoring intercepted radio transmissions, identified Russian voices among the attackers. Immediately, alerts were sent through the deconfliction line to the Russian command, informing them about the presence of coalition and Syrian Democratic Forces in the region and requesting restraint to avoid escalation. The Russians claimed that they had no forces there. Troops increased near the Euphrates, adding to the pro-Assad militias. A concentration of more than 500 fighters loyal to Assad, along with 27 vehicles such as T-72 tanks and armored transports, was observed a few kilometers east of the Euphrates River near the Konoko plant. About 30 kilometers from Konoko, a support post, the mission support site housed a quick reaction team. This team, made up of Green Berets and a Marine infantry platoon, maintained constant surveillance through drone footage, prepared to respond to any eventuality. At dusk, Apostol continued with the column, excited about the advance. It would be an epic and long-awaited event. Russian troops facing the Americans in combat. It was time to test those so-called special forces of Delta Force and Rangers from the Joint Special Operations Command who were with the Syrian Democratic Forces in Konoko. At 8:30 at night, under the desert night sky, 3 T-72 tanks stopped less than a kilometer from the plant. Close enough for accurate shots. Inside, Americans prepared their weapons, already sending messages to the support post. Only almost 2 hours later, the shooting started. Fire rained down on the Americans and Kurds barricaded in the plant. They hid in Itera's trenches, smelling the smoke in the night. It was a moment of glory for Apostol and Wagner, watching the Americans cornered. Their confidence grew with the enemy's first reaction. Officers in the field and at the command center urgently communicated with their Russian counterparts on the deconfliction line, reporting the attack and requesting their intervention to stop the attacking forces. The Russian command and the Syrian command replied that it was not their problem. The next reaction did not scare Apostol. They were just warning shots bursting in the night. The column's advance continued. The smile on Apostol's face disappeared when the first Hellfire missile landed on the column. The American MQ-9 Reaper drone that had been flying overhead began firing repeatedly. The explosions were now meant to kill. F-22 Raptor jets swooped down to drop bombs on the convoy, increasing the chaos that began to form. The metal of the armored vehicles twisted under the fire. Men ran screaming for deities and for their mothers in different languages. Apostol tried to protect himself in the midst of the chaos, holding his K-74 while some of the leaders tried to organize the soldiers. The F-15 Strike Eagle joined the slaughter, firing missiles at the ground like the air-to-ground missile 65 Maverick, which released 57 kilograms of explosives on the Russians. Apostol saw comrades fall in these attacks. Even so, with Konoko nearby, he joined the troops who fired at the Americans, including with towed artillery. The noise of the AC-130 marked its presence in the sky. 20mm, 40mm, and 105mm cannons struck terror into the minds of those who witnessed it. The smaller calibers pierced armor or tore men in half. The larger ones exploded next to the soldiers. It seemed like hell would never end. The sounds of the Apache helicopters stood out over the crackling of the fire, the screams of the wounded, and even over the artillery pieces of the Wagner group. The Hellfire missiles from the helicopter silenced the towed howitzer. Apostol saw how something kept flying from somewhere, point by point, toward the equipment that had somehow scattered. And in the middle of it all, the Ural military truck was simply crushed as if it were made of styrofoam. Apostol was still with the response to the threat. The column's only hope was to move forward. They heard about a group approaching to support the Americans. They fired back and managed to stop those Green Berets and Marines in their MRAPs. But the American planes were still active. It was past 11 o'clock at night when the last piece of artillery and the last tank disappeared under the smoke of yet another explosion. Apostol walked among the burning vehicles, looking at Vladislav Panchuk, another of the mercenaries who had been with him on the day of the Sledgehammer. They looked at each other about the situation. Shortly after, a new explosion threw Panchuk against a destroyed armored vehicle. An M42 Raymar had started firing. The Marines' equipment waited patiently at a safe distance. Then, when it received the command, it released its precise payload, a cascade of guided rockets that traveled with determination to find their target among the enemy ranks. Apostol finally fell wounded, bleeding profusely from so many places that he himself couldn't explain. Inside Konoko, the Americans and cultists held out even as their ammunition was running out. Outside, the reinforcements, 40 soldiers, expanded the perimeter. Heavy machine guns from the vehicle turrets were used, and snipers employed thermal sights to identify enemies hidden in the darkness. It was the final blow. At 2 in the morning, the Syrian and Russian troops finally withdrew. Only one Kurd was injured inside Konul. Outside, the numbers varied depending on the source. Some spoke of 100, others of 300 dead, in addition to dozens of wounded. The next day, the Americans watched as aid workers arrived to collect corpses and men who were still groaning. Vladislav bled to death. Some say he was even taken for medical treatment. But, as with everything in this battle, the accounts vary. Many even claimed that the battle never happened. Even Gozin posted photos of the incident and claimed it was one of the first betrayals he suffered from the Russian Ministry of Defense, which did not provide them with air support. Sources from the Wagner group claimed that the destruction was so great that by morning it was possible to see how the melted sand had solidified and the barrels of the weapons had been bent by the hellish heat of war that fell upon them. Among the Buta killers, their fates varied. Korongir Mirazorov fought in Africa, but was dismissed for drug use in September 2018. Stanislav Ditko left for health reasons and was hospitalized at the Central Military Clinical Hospital of Chinevsky, diagnosed with depressive syndrome in 2019. He changed his name in 2020 and disappeared. Mikhail Masharov was punished and expelled because of what happened with Buta in the Hammer case. Not because of the murder, but because the video was released. Vladimir Kitaev continued as a mercenary in the Wagner group fighting in Africa, eventually commanding a battalion. Vladislav Panchuk suffered a traumatic brain injury in Kachan, but returned to duty and continued serving in the 4th Assault Detachment. After that, their records disappeared. Oleg Kong and Andrei Bakunovich also vanished. Vladislav Apostol became a hero to many. There were ignorant people who never watched the video and adored his symbol. There were those who praised him precisely because of the video. The brutality was appreciated by the Wagner group, which adopted the sledgehammer as one of its main symbols. There were pets that were used by its mercenaries or by people who became fans of the private military company. During the invasion of Ukraine, the orchestra was considered a terrorist group by the European Union, and in response, they sent a sledgehammer. An iconic video became famous during the invasion of Ukraine after 2022, when a former prisoner who signed a contract with the Wagner group deserted, but later ended up again in the hands of Prigozhin's group. In the footage, he appears with his head restrained, while behind him a man holds a sledgehammer. With just one blow, the skull was cracked and the brutality of the propaganda went viral, showing how well the business of death was doing. Later, business got worse, and there were those who negotiated death better than Wagner grew Apostol, and his sledgehammer became a world-famous symbol, a crime of torture in which laughter echoed alongside the suffering of a man. Would that be a reason for so many people to display images associated with Evan? It was the kind of pride that awakens in the hearts of men in war or in peace, showing only part of the rot that can hide in the human soul.